All right, I'm going to start all over again with, on the second page of the sheet from last week, if you don't have one, there's a copy here. What we did was we built on the pyramid that we had started before, and then we're going to take away the middle level, which was basically there is this ideal concept of Kodesh Elyon, of literally the higher holiness. Now, a couple of things about this ideal. This, on the one hand, can be used to express God in his own domain that we aspire to get as close to God as possible, but obviously we don't know God directly. But this is kind of the higher realm, the ideal realm. And if you remember, we said beneath it was the concept of Kodesh and Chol, holiness and mundane, and that the holiness and mundane are not really in conflict. There are times that they're in conflict, but really what they are they are parallel to each other. And right, the holiness is supposed to draw out of the Chol, right? Remember we had that whole lecture on the kind of the inverse of the black hole, where everything is imbued, like the fruit of the tree we talked about is imbued with the essence of the fruit, or should have been. So everything is drawn together. So then he talks about, in the essay that we didn't really look at, we looked at a parallel essay in Orot, we didn't look at the actual essay in Zeronim, of what he calls the war of opinion and belief. I copied some excerpts from that for you to read on your own afterwards, and you'll see just how difficult a read it is. And I'm going to try to expound on it outside for tonight's purposes. But the idea was, as we mentioned last night, there are these three forces that are exist in any society, any individual. There's the religious or spiritual force, the holy force, right? Force of holiness. There is a nationalistic force, which can be the one to a commitment to community and or country. And then there is the humanist force, or what we'll call the universal. Some call it the ethical, moral ideal. And what we said last time was that each of these have their own energy. And that the intention is that they coexist. So, for this purposes, we'll be referring to this quite a bit. So as you'll see, and if you want to pass these out, sorry, I didn't do that sooner. There you go. So now this is going to be basically the idea that we're going to be talking about. Religiosity, humanity, nationalism, right, as the base of the Kodesh Elyon, right, the more supernal holiness that he mentions in the essay we read last week. And just to contradict myself, who doesn't have a copy of last week's essay?
No.
You have it. You have it. All right. So if you look at the second page of that essay, kind of the end of the essay, he says in the last paragraph, it is understood that a lumping of the holy as one of the three elements, each of which must sometimes restrain itself in order to leave space for the other, applies only to the technical and practical side of the holy, and to the intellectual and emotional side that relates thereto. In other words, when we talk about religiosity or holiness over here, we're talking about holiness in its practical manifestations. And here's the key sentence. However, the essence of supernal holiness, right, the top of that pyramid, is the general subject. This very restraint is part of its task, just as all tasks that come to perfect the world and life carry their blessing from the holy. So in other words, the source, right, is the elevated supernal holiness, right? But when we talk about holiness on the other plane, we're talking about our practical involvement in religious tasks and identity. Therefore, the exalted ideal thought, the divine thought, is truly free of all restrictions, right? It's not it's not restricted by the relationship between these three, as we'll see. Closest to God is filled always with an expansiveness beyond all borders. All right, so we'll stop there. You can read the essay at your leisure. So we have these three ideas, and what we said last week was that what tends to happen is a person tends to choose one of these three things above the others. We'll see it in a little more detail tonight, that when one only embraces the one against the other, then what happens is the one wants to consume or destroy the others. It becomes aggressive and vitriolic, as we said, towards the others. What happens when that happens is, instead of being a source of creative energy together, they become a force committed to the negation of the other two. Truth, love of truth, aspirations towards truth vanish as people from groups centered around one of these particular forces gather around one of these forces and engage in bringing down their rivals. So how do we restore the equilibrium? By orienting ourselves to view life from the inner perspective of the Kodesh Elyon, where holiness and godliness finds expression not just in the Beit Midrash, but in the broader endeavors of humanity. What we said, and when you'll read this essay, if you haven't already, is this whole idea of truth, that we lose truth, love of truth, aspirations towards truth. We see it today when we start becoming polarized, and our position is the only position. We can't see the other side. We can't, quote unquote, tolerate the other side. That's what tends to happen, right? We reimagine truth as only being my truth, and everything else is an alternate or false truth. So that was our conversation last week. Okay, so if you now take the what I put together for you now, let's go a little deeper into where he arrives at this. So kind of more of the sourcing for this, as best as I can share it with you. So let's just summarize. Again, these three forces, religiosity, humanism, nationalism, they all exist in some way, shape, or form in what we call the human spirit, right? We all tend towards a belief, a sense of some kind of connection to community, nation, whatever it happens to be, some kind of affiliation, and also certain what we'll call universal humanitarian ideals. That's part of the nature of the human spirit, right? And compete in each of these, then compete for man's attention, commitment, and energy. Any group or individual will, if allowed, tend towards one particular force, resulting in conflict and not in harmony. That's what we just said. To succeed and to prosper, you must recognize the importance of all three forces. While one may be justified in looking after his particular force, or hers, he ignores the others at his own peril. We must learn and grow from them all. Okay? That's a summary. In order for us to get to this idea, as I mentioned before, we have to kind of start from a place of a higher level, which is this ideal of Kodesh Elyon. If we're trying to aspire towards a higher plane of existence and thought and practice, then we have to start from there and realize that there's a need for harmony between these three. How do we get to that is another conversation. So I want to share with you what a synopsis of his essay on the War of Opinions and Belief. This is a summary. It's not my own. It's Rav Hillel Rahmani's summary. And here is where he begins. He begins by talking about what we're going to see in a minute is going to be weak tolerance versus what I guess is a stronger tolerance, and zealousness. And here's how he gets there. He compares monotheism to polytheism. So, what is monotheism?
Belief in one God.
Belief in one God and only one God. Thank you. Belief in one God and only one God. So by definition, as a monotheist, my religious view is very strong and very exclusionary. Now, as a polytheist, what does that mean? Let's first of all define that term. If I'm a polytheist, what do I believe?
Multiple gods.
There are multiple gods, right? Do I necessarily have to believe in all those gods?
I don't know. I'm not a polytheist.
No.
Okay, let me ask the question. Do you think that a polytheist has to believe in every god?
No. Well, they're going to believe in whatever ones that they have an identity with.
Okay, very good. A polytheist will believe in the god or gods that it identifies with. What about the rest of the gods?
Acknowledges their existence, maybe?
Okay. Yes, to what extent? What does the polytheist acknowledge?
Well,
whether he acknowledges their existence or not, what will the polytheist agree to or accede to?
They're not all equal.
That there is a
There
God.
might be
You're
others,
right.
That there might be others.
You're right to believe in your God.
Oh.
You're right to believe in your God. Now, does that get us, is that closer to this ideal of tolerance? Is that tolerant? Is that tolerant?
sounds like it.
Yes. I have my God, you have your God. Okay? That's tolerant. But this is what Rav Kook refers to as a weak tolerance. Because it's, live and let live. But I have my God, you can have your God, but I don't really care about your God. There's no connection there. So that's what he calls a weak tolerance. Now, what a monotheism sometimes leads to is a certain, on the other extreme perhaps, is this idea that my God and only my God, therefore you must believe in my God, because it's the only true God. And that becomes at least a zealous action. So one is a tolerance, an apathetic tolerance, and one is a very active intolerance. You tracking with me? Okay, it's really hard to keep this simple. I read one essay that it was just, I have it here, but it's just too hard to do in a class and not lose half of you, or more than half of you at least. So, okay, maybe, or let me put it this way. I'm sorry, that's condescending. I had trouble staying with half of it, so forgive me. Okay, so if you look in the sheet, let's look inside for a minute, just so we're really clear. So monotheism. So one of the basic requirements of a scientific theory is that it explains a number of phenomena. Now this is I want to bring you inside the process by which Rav Kook comes to these ideas. So he has a very scientific, on the one hand he can be very scientific, he can be very Kabbalistic, and he can be very universalistic. Rav Kook embodied these three ideals, which is amazing. Universalism, strong sense of religiosity, which is going to lead us to a conflict that we'll have to resolve before we can go, and this idea of nationalism. So he starts from a scientific point of view. He says, how does science work? As a theory develops and is improved, it can be used to explain more phenomena, right? What does a scientist want to do? Wants to find a theory or a formula or a mathematical algorithm that does what?
Can you repeat it?
That accounts for everything. Doesn't account for part of something, but accounts for as much as it can.
Okay.
So as a theory develops and is improved, it can be used to explain more phenomena, right? The ultimate theory being one that explains all phenomena. Such an all-encompassing, generalized theory would convince its observers both that the theory is true as the other theories are false, right? If you came up with the formula to explain the universe, right, and you believe it to be true, then by definition all other theories would be false. So So it is with any generalized idea. The more inclusive it is in terms of application, the more people believe in its truth and that it alone represents the truth. So this principle can be extended to the God idea, as it were. Believers in a single, all-powerful, all-knowing God believe not only that they are in possession of truth, but they are its sole guardians. All other beliefs are incorrect. This in turn leads to zeal, kanaut, which often characterizes monotheism. The zeal is seen in its most extreme in the religious war, which is the use of force to compel others to accept your truth. Right? Think crusades. Okay, so that's one idea about monotheism. Now, if Rav Kook's going to have, if Rav Kook believes, he's certainly a monotheist, but he doesn't believe in this approach to monotheism. We'll see. In a polytheistic society, on the other hand, it is not typified by this type of zeal and tolerance. Although groups may go to war, they do not attempt to increase the strength, influence, and rule of their individual gods. In other words, they're going to war for other reasons. Territory, power, control, whatever it might happen to be, monetary resources, whatever it might happen to be, but not necessarily to change one's belief system. Within a single polytheistic society, worship of a whole range of gods can be tolerated, and there's no stigma attached to changing gods. If a polytheist were to walk into a synagogue, you have no qualms about praying to God too. Right? So either a polytheist is either one of two things: tolerant of other people having other gods, but I have my God, or I'm okay with different gods, and I might go from God to God, or I might say, well, let me try your God out and see how it works. So Rav Kook calls a type of tolerance found in pluralistic societies a weak tolerance. This tolerance has as its central dogma, you do what you do, I'll do what I do. In other words, anything goes. So why is this considered weak? It is considered weak because it's a tolerance of limitation, a tolerance resulting from a narrow perspective. So he wants to now, returning to the color analogy, right? He said, you're red and I'm blue and he's green, right? But we don't, there's no harmony here. We're all in our own world, right? I don't necessarily have any connection or concern for the blue or the green as a red. So that's why he calls it a weak tolerance. Where was I? So he says, for example, you are, for example, red, the person next to you is blue. This weak tolerance means that you will not fight, right? You'll recognize that although you are different, you are equals. The weakness, however, lies in the fact that there is no unity, no shared goal. By ignoring others, you fail to appreciate a higher truth. Okay, so that's what he wants to say. In other words, I'm in my box, and the fact that I'm not willing to go outside of my box, I can't get up to that higher truth. So, you only ever see one perspective, your own. As much as a society can generate tolerance, it can also produce intolerance, what Rav Kook terms pernicious zeal. This is the worst possible relationship which can exist between groups in society. I'm red and I'm right. All the blues and greens are wrong and must be red like me. It is pernicious in that it is so destructive, as we have already seen. Is pernicious that it's so destructive, as we already seen. A healthy society requires a mixture of all the colors, yada yada. The pernicious zealot has no moral basis for demanding others adopt his position. Ultimately, objectively, is no more valuable than them, just different. Now, you can see why Rav Kook's philosophy on this particular topic didn't necessarily win him a whole lot of fans in the Haredi community of his time, right? Because that is how they felt. But what he's trying to balance is a number of things. One, he's still dealing with the secular versus the religious in Israel, and the fact that he sees them both as doing holy work, and also his sense of the aesthetic of universal ideas. And he was very into art. There's a famous can't remember the whole story, I think it's in the book on Rav Kook, about the We went to see the Rembrandt, I think it was in London, that he went to see an original Rembrandt and commented on it. He was very much into the aesthetic of art and appreciated the aesthetic of art, which was unusual for a religious personality of that time, a Jewish religious personality of that time, who didn't really see art as something that a religious personality should engage with. So he goes on. So what's the ideal relationship between groups? Not a weak tolerance, but a strong tolerance. So what he calls a zealous tolerance or a tolerant zeal. So he wanted to take you have tolerance on one side, which was weak because it was, you do what you do, I'll do what I do, but I don't care about you and you don't have to care about me. That was weak tolerance. Then there's the other side, right? The zealot, who it's my way and only my way, and I have to convince you of my way. What he sees as the more middle ground was either, like I said, a zealous tolerance or a tolerant zeal. What does he mean by that? What do those two words mean together? Based on what I just shared with you. What are your thoughts? I want to wake you up a little bit, put you to sleep. What's a zealous tolerance?
They're each a way of moving toward the other, and maybe even resolving.
What does the word zeal imply?
Strong opinion,
Passion.
Activity,
Passion.
enthusiasm.
Okay.
Actually,
What'd you say?
Strong. I said strong.
Okay.
activity.
It also implies action.
Okay.
A zealot acts. There's no couch zealot.
Yeah.
Right? Pinchas is the prime example of a zealot, of a kanai, right? He takes the spear and he runs with it. That's the kind of that he's first talking about, where it's my way. Maybe not. So, but the idea is when you put zeal into something, zeal means you do something with zeal, but you have to do something. You can't sit on the sidelines. You can't sit in your own little area space, right? You get involved. But your zeal is tolerant. So in other words, what it implies is some kind of interaction between these other colors, right? That there is some kind of appreciation and wanting to at least see a positive value, not just an indifference in the other.
Perhaps even dictating, though. Perhaps even dictating that interaction. Because,
What do you mean?
well, that you're zealous, you have your position, but you're zealous to have interaction with the others, and so therefore it dictates that you pursue interaction with the others.
I'll accept that. So you recognize that whereas you are red and your neighbor is blue, you're both equally important. So that's number one. Not just you do what you want, but quite frankly, I believe my God is the more important God, but I'm not going to impose it on you. That's the weak tolerance. This is not saying that, you have your God, but this is saying that what? Your God is as important to you as my God is to me, and I acknowledge that, yet different. So, at different aspects of white. What does it mean, different aspects of white? As long as that belief is, in your mind, a reflection of the Kodesh Elyon, right, is an aspect of the white to you, right? So I can acknowledge that. In other words, see, look where he's going. Is Islam for a Muslim a bad thing, or is Islam for a Muslim an acceptable approach? Depending on how you define your Islam, right? So, or, a Christian to be a good Christian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? There's positives in that. Nowhere in the Torah does it say everybody has to be a Jew. In fact, we'd have a problem with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of antithetical to our whole belief system in some ways.
So when light passes through a prism,
Yes?
it divides into the colors.
Correct.
And they're different and they're of equal value.
Correct. I didn't say it here. So it's very, very interesting. I'll digress for a minute before you go. So I think I mentioned It was on Shabbat. So Rabbi Morris and I are studying Nefesh HaChaim, which is very esoteric and taking us both out of our comfort zone. It's very Kabbalistic. So one of the things that the Nefesh HaChaim is talking about is you have to be very careful to not make Judaism into pantheism, right? That God, when you say God is everywhere, you can very easily become a pantheist. So what the Nefesh HaChaim makes a distinction is there's God really even above this Kodesh Elyon. There's everything is of God, but God isn't part of everything. It's almost like it's an illusion to a certain extent. And what he says is, when it says, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, that or Ein Od Milva, that there's God and his Elokim. God, the ineffable name of God, that's God as we can't ever know him. That's why it's ineffable. We can't ever know God. But Elokim is how God manifests himself in this world. He's like the Kodesh Elyon. Elokim is the Kodesh Elyon, and all the colors that we see are the light coming through the prism, the different manifestations of God. Right? So this could be one example of that. So when I say different manifestations of God, right, we're told sometimes God is a warrior, sometimes God has an outstretched arm, sometimes God is angry, sometimes God is compassionate, right? Sometimes, well, God isn't any of those things. We don't know what God is. We only see that through the prism. We only see that manifestation of God, meaning that that's an attribute. That's how God manifests himself in this world, but it's not God. So, and he says something very similar here. He says, the ideal relationship between groups, therefore, is not a weak tolerance, but a strong one, a zealous tolerance, a tolerant zeal. You recognize that whereas you are red and your neighbor is blue, you're both equally important, yet different aspects of white. You're equally important, yet different aspects of white. Once you recognize that everything is bathed in the upper white light of unity, that's the Kodesh Elyon, which descends from a single God, and the origin of your red and your neighbor's blue, is then possible for different groups within society to live side by side without conflict and in unity. Unity of origin, and unity of goal, unity of essence. Okay.
But that's requiring that you accept or recognize that everything is bathed in that white light of the unity.
Correct.
So if within your own groups you don't see that common, then you aren't.
So that's where I started from. This only works if you understand this idea of the Kodesh Elyon, right? That ultimately there is God up there, and there's various manifestations or emanations or rays that come in different colors of the rainbow from God. So I'll tell you. There's another way to give an example of this. He gives the example of an orchestra. So if I am a violinist and I am a zealot, right? What do I believe? I believe that the violin is the only instrument, and everybody should play the violin, right? And every piece of the orchestra should be a violin, playing the same piece that I'm playing. So, right? So it's going to be a very monotone, right? Monotheistic, monotone kind of piece. On the other hand, if I believe in kind of the polytheistic approach, what does that mean? It means I like the oboe, and that person likes the cello, and that person likes the trombone. But you know what? We're all playing with headphones on, not hearing each other. So I'm playing what I'm playing, and she's playing what she's playing. Everyone's playing what they want to play, right? So the person without headphones on is going to hear a cacophony, exactly, of sound that doesn't really have any set pattern. On the other hand, right, if I understand, if I understand that there is a conductor, right, and therefore I play the violin and you play this, then you have a symphony. right? But you need to understand that not only do I have a passion for the violin, but there's a conductor, and I have to follow the pieces the conductor lays it out, right? So if Islam has its whatever, and then perhaps that's how it all plays out. I have to play my part, and then if I do it again with there's a whole level of ethics and universal principles that have to go into that. But again, it all comes from that idea and that ideal. Okay. So that's all great and wonderful, except there's a problem. There's a problem with Rav Kook that has to be resolved. Because going contrary to all of this but Judaism is different. In other words, you can't, there is no tolerance for anything that will diminish Jewish practice, Jewish belief. So how do you resolve that with this idea of this, tolerance? So now, again, remember what he's trying to deal with. He's trying to create a sense of peace and harmony, right, between the secularists, the religious Jews, and his own universal concepts of aesthetic morals and ethics. But at the same time, he can't accept that if given their way, many of the pioneers, certainly the socialist one, would do away with religion altogether, would have a state that has no religion, would have a state that has no connection to Judaism, except maybe some historical history, which I think we talked about a little bit, or he brings up in his essay, actually in the essay. If you read the essay, he mentions that the historical side. So how do we understand that he says, yes, we have to be tolerant, we have to be, quote unquote, pluralistic, but not when Judaism is threatened? So part of it goes back to, underlying that, I'll give you the answer in a minute, or at least one way to approach it, but underlying that, remember, was, going back to our first set of essays, that when we talked about that light at the center, which also represented the Kodesh Elyon, remember we said that light ultimately finds its source in Israel, right, at the Temple Mount, through the Jewish people, and it is through us, right, that we draw out our involvement in the physical world is what draws out the rays of light, read holiness, that is embedded in everything that is mundane. Remember that conversation. So what he says is as follows. He uses the following example. Democracy, right, has certain principles. One of the principles of democracy is the right to vote. But would democratic principles tolerate fascists or others to supplant the democracy using a democratic system? Or are there fail-safes to that? In other words, does the idea of being democratic mean that you can vote out democracy?
It's a good question, but no.
It's a good question.
This is sort of some similar to the question in Israel, with the in terms of it as being a Jewish state, or being a
right. That's one of the big
for Jews.
Right, correct. That finds its. So he says as follows. So the problem is that Rav Kook says that freedom of expression and thought should be limited when people are damaging the definition of the essence of Israel. Well, wait a minute. If we're saying we'd be tolerant, why shouldn't their view be tolerant? They have the right to have that view. Why do we? Notice he's tolerant, but how can he not be tolerant of that view?
Wait, what was the view? Say it again. When he wasn't tolerant?
if you believe in freedom of expression, right? Part of his universal color there, right? And thought should be, he says that freedom of expression and thought can or should be limited when that freedom of thought or expression is damaging to the essence of Israel, being the Jewish people or Judaism. Why? Why is that so? Why is it allowed to not be tolerant there? Why is that not worthy
Well,
of
because
toleration?
I would say that if you're because Israel is part of that definition with the Kodesh Elyon, and so if you are excluding Israel, then you're not accepting that mantle of Kodesh Elyon, and so therefore you are outside of the pale for being where the tolerance should exist.
Essentially, that's correct. But here's how he gets there. So it's kind of a surprising response. So he says that belief in unity is the basis for all tolerance. Right? There's that ultimate unity that comes from the Kodesh Elyon, as you just said. Without the platform of divine unity of existence, what you just said, without that platform, in other words, the whole belief system is based on this idea of Kodesh Elyon. There's this basis, right? So without that platform of divine unity of existence, right? Divine unity of existence, something unifies all existence. That's God, right? Kodesh Elyon. Then what? Then there's no basis for tolerance. And he says it leads to a simple conclusion, according to him. It's like if you cut off the branch of the Jewish people's faith, this is what he's kind of saying now, to say if you cut off the branch of Jewish people's faith, he says it's like cutting off the branch that you're sitting on. Right? It's like being out on the limb and you cutting the limb from the tree. You're gonna fail. You're gonna be destroyed. You're gonna fall. You're gonna fall into oblivion is what's gonna happen. So he says again, this is compared to, he says, a fascist or racist party that runs an election, right, in a democratic society and demands legitimacy in the name of democracy. He says democracy is a political and social platform that allows for the existence of different opinions. Right, that's what democracy is. We can all have our opinion, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. There's a lot on freedom of expression in this essay. And however, he says, however, it would not allow that freedom of expression, right? Can't uproot the Constitution. We don't allow freedom of expression, of individual expression, to uproot the Constitution. So he wants to say is, so the idea of the Jewish ideal to him, that's like the Constitution. That's a priori, right? That it comes before everything else, and therefore tolerance cannot tolerate those who act against it. So since the foundation of tolerance is, according to Rav Kook, the belief in divine unity, a Jew attempts to disconnect the Jewish people from their faith identity, acts against the very foundation of tolerance. So he tries to go on and explain it. So what he ends up landing is as follows: that he has a system. By the way, that's why he calls it on the war between opinion and belief. That's why this essay is called, because he's in conflict. His conflict, right, is between opinion. His opinion is that we should be able to live in a universal pluralistic society, but when it comes in conflict with our basic beliefs, we cannot shutter our beliefs for the sake of that pluralistic harmony. What everybody has to do is acknowledge. That's why I started. Yes, you have to acknowledge the top of the pyramid, the Kodesh Elyon. If you acknowledge that, then there is room within the system for a certain pluralism of expression and tolerance, right? Not having to be you don't have to be a zealot. Everybody doesn't have to be frum. But everybody has to identify with certain base ideas and principles. And you have the right to live as you want to live and to believe as you want to believe. But if that belief in any way will cut off the connection to that primary belief, he says that's not tolerable. And that's why it's called being conflict between opinion and belief. Let's see if we can maybe manage with that to read some of his essay. Let me see if I give you a strong enough basis for that. Okay. I can go over it again, but it's just going to be more of that. So if you take this other page that you have, that's what's taking me a while to get across, but
Which one is
it was with the hand. Could I hand it out with what I gave you?
The handout we just got today.
Yes, second page of the handout.
Oh,
Yeah. It says extras from Rav Kook's essay on. Yeah, there. The third page. Okay. In particular, those who wish to define the soul and spiritual content of Judaism by familiar definitions are mistaken. Even though it is possible to define its revealed and historically palpable content. It includes everything in its soul and all spiritual tendencies revealed and hidden. It includes everything in its soul and all spiritual tendencies revealed and hidden are concealed in it in its most sublime universal form, just as everything is contained within the absolute divinity. So what he's trying to say here again is he's trying to talk about this Kodesh Elyon idea. Any such definition is akin to erecting an idol or a statue to characterize the divine. So what he's trying to say here is this Kodesh Elyon is a representation. It's not God. It's a representation. It's the manifestation, but it's not God himself. In this sense, the value of Israel, who carries Judaism amongst the nation, is similar to the value of man amongst all creatures. Listen carefully what he's saying here.
well, wait a minute. When he's talking Israel, does he mean, which wasn't in his time, but does he mean the country of Israel or the people of Israel?
He means the people, the nation of Israel. Israel, the people. Yeah, that's what he means. So he says. He says, don't apply all of this that we're talking about. Is not what we know of, what we spiritually define, reveal, is hidden. None of that is God. It's a manifestation of God. It's how we understand God. It's how we interact with God. It's not God. The Kodesh Elyon is representation of God in this world. But don't confuse it for God. That's the first thing you say.
In this world, you just said that.
Yeah.
No, that was important. I didn't get
In this
that
world,
before.
yeah.
That's all right.
But now he wants us to define. So in this sense, the value of Israel, who carries Judaism amongst the nations, is similar to the value of man amongst the creatures. This sounds a little bit like, or could sound a little bit like Yehuda Halevi, who basically, kind of says there's inanimate objects, plants, animals, man, Jew. But what he's saying here, but it's not exactly what he's saying. Listen carefully what he's saying. Many creatures have advantages that man does not have, but the universal combination of capabilities and their sublimation to the spiritual and the intelligence to use all powers contained within himself, in actuality and in potential, transform man into the highest division in the world. In other words, there are animals that can jump higher than man. There are creatures that can hear better than man. There are creatures that can do right. There's a lot of animals in the world that can do individual things better than man can, but man can do all of these things and more. Correct? That's what he wants to say. That man's at the pinnacle of creation. What he wants to say on a spiritual, metaphysical plane is that Israel, the Jewish people, are analogous to that within the realm of the metaphysical world. However, Israel, as the concentrate of all humanity, gathers in all of the capabilities of all the nations and unifies them in an ideal and holy manner in sublime unity. What's that sublime unity? The Kodesh Elyon. That's, again, that idea we talked about. Through Israel is drawn all of the positive holiness that exists in all people and in all things. Right? It's a restatement of that idea. The application is what's impossible. For every revelation of this is now skipping. This is now another passage. For every revelation of universal spirit, based on the strength of its universalism, certainty is strengthened within it within it based on the degree of its certitude. So now he's talking about this other concept, right? As one, here he's using universalism here, talking about the idea of, as I become more and more certain that my idea encompasses everything, I become more certain. When I become more certain, I become more zealous. Just as certitude leaves no space for doubt, right? If I'm certain, then I have no doubt. So too does not extend the right to others to collaborate with it. This is where he's getting this idea of the idea of it's my way and it's only my way. Universalism, certainty, and singularity depend upon each other. And so what he's trying to say is there has to be a balance. So too in spiritual manifestations, idolatry was tolerant. This is what I said earlier, right? And the idea of polytheism, idolatry was tolerant, and the acknowledgement of singularity was zealous. So he's saying these are the two poles, right? Polytheism, idolatry, was tolerant of other idolatries, whereas acknowledgement of singularity, there's only one way, a monotheistic way, was zealous, right? It had to be, it was actively pursuing only its belief and no other belief. Since it is universal and not particular, certain and not in doubt, it is singular and not composite. When he says the idea universal here is not universalism, it's universal, meaning it's all-encompassing. My belief now is all-encompassing, right? It's not particular, it's certain, and there's no doubt. Therefore, it is singular and not composite, meaning I can't work with anybody or anything. There's no room for anything else. So that's the way, in his own words, how he develops this idea. Lastly, universality is not tolerant according to the superficial form of tolerance. Right? Again, something that encompasses, that for me, that encompasses my entire belief system is not tolerant for the reasons mentioned in the paragraph above. But the essential basis of tolerance is to be found in its zeal. Weak tolerance, which weakens life, comes from within particular expressions of spirit that are not nurtured by the dew of universalism. In other words, live and let live. It's not all-encompassing. So that's a positive, right? It's a tolerance. And it's also not nurtured by the cursed, and the cursed zeal comes from presumptuously considering these particular discoveries of spirit to be the most sublime of all universals, since they are merely particular expressions, they cannot animate. Since they are merely particular expressions, they cannot animate all of the varieties of spirit outside their domain. In other words, both of these are lacking. They can't encompass the other. And what he wants to say is they can't animate, notice the word animate, they can't animate all the variety of spirit outside of their domain. In other words, what you want is a tolerance that activates. You want a tolerance that animates, that gets everybody engaged. And due to their disdain for other expressions, they're unable to include them. They only minimize the expansion of life, right? Again, when it's particularistic, they only minimize the expansion of life and diminish the manifestations of spiritual expressions. The highest universalism, however, specifically through its breadth and certainty, offers a sublime attribute by insisting on singularity, which brings with it a blessed zeal that engenders spiritual grandeur, which removes from its path any weakness of particular trivialities, any doubt, and any syncretism. This is his reference to the Kodesh Elyon, right? God alone will lead them, and there is no foreign God with him. Since it is universal, I don't know if everybody subscribes to that, since everything is included within it, it is naturally unable to remove anything from its domain and universality, and it gives everything its place. In other words, if you accept the top of the page, if you accept God as the source of all things, then that which emanates from it all has value, and you have to be able to value across that spectrum. That's what he's saying. It knows that there is a spark of light in everything. That inner divine light shines in each of the different religions as different educational orders for human cultures to repair spirit and matter, time and world, individual and in community, but they exist on different levels. That last sentence really sums it all up. He believes that if you accept the idea of God, a universal idea of God, then you can accept that God has manifested and mandated that for certain peoples there are certain beliefs, and those beliefs are appropriate for those people, even if they're not appropriate for other people. But one must value both the right for that to exist and the value of that in this world. Listen to what he says one more time. It knows that there is a spark of light in everything. That's not new. We've discussed that since the beginning about Rav Kook. This idea of sparks of light in everything. That the inner divine light, that the Kodesh Elyon, shines in each of the different religions as different educational orders for human cultures to repair spirit and matter. In other words, there's a tikkun, and each, maybe even other religions, have a role in that tikkun. He doesn't explain what that is or how that is, simply that it is. That if I, as an observant Jew, believe in Kodesh Elyon, and I know God created other people and other religions, that they must have some value. I don't know what that value is. I can't begin to tell what that value is. Certainly because some of those people fall into the same trap of zealousness and certitude and a universal belief in their belief and only their belief. They're as intolerant as sometimes I'm intolerant. But if they can step out of that, just like I can step out of it, and say that God created this, there's a value and a reason and a purpose and a tikkun to be had, then there can be true tolerance. That's what he calls zealous tolerance. Okay, that's what he means. Then divine sights in each of the different religions as different educational orders for human cultures to repair spirit and matter, time and world, individual and community, but they exist on different levels, right? They can be red, they can be blue, they can be green. And a red doesn't have to be blue and a blue doesn't have to be green for there to be value in what God expects of them. That's what he's trying to communicate in this essay. But he sees it through the lens that while all of that is true, Israel is the guiding light and the primary source to which all of this is being drawn, and then up to the Kodesh Elyon. So there is a certain particularistic aspect, which is what he's all about, the universal and the particular. It comes from a particularistic point of view.
But it also set up some of the current political issues in Israel, because if the unifying principle in Israel is secular, then you can't use religious rules and protect them. If the unifying principle is religious, then you can. And this doesn't answer that, what that unifying principle should be for the state of Israel, not the Jewish people. But
I think, again,
I know what his answer would be.
I think his answer would be that it has to be religious.
Right.
But a tolerant religious. It can't be
right,
what what we see today in most societies, where maybe it was always like where religion rules the state, right? Whether it's in certain Islamic countries, whether it's previously in certain Christian Europe or elsewhere, where the religion really did dictate certain ideals and actions and beliefs. He, I think, believed that, but without being fundamentalist about it. And for a while, even in Israel, it worked for a while. Before you had certain parties that were very fundamental in their belief and outlook and how they use the political system today, which is, we see what's happening right now. Yeah, but again, he's trying to put forth, again, this is all philosophy, this is all ideal, this is all theory and not necessarily practical, but it's beautiful how he both struggles with and yet tries to create a system to be able to contain that conflict of particular and universal. Again, what Rabbi Soloveitchik does on a religious, spiritual realm and in practical application of halacha, but not having to deal with the idea of a state or of a people state. Rav Kook really tries to imagine it, because he's dealing with the pioneers, tries to deal with the same idea in a different practical context. So, and I think it's beautiful. I don't agree with all of it. It's hard to agree with all of it, but it's just incredible to see how he was able to imagine it and how he was able to describe it. So it actually took a week and a half probably to cover opinions and beliefs. So I still have, I think, 3 sessions to go instead of 2. So I'll probably have to add a class for sure, if maybe more. And again, we're not meeting again until 2 weeks from tonight. I'll be away again this coming Monday. So I wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving and a happy Hanukkah coming up very soon. Hopefully we'll meet before Hanukkah. I'm very excited to, I can turn this off.